Hi, I'm Mike. You ever see the movie Holes? Neither have I. But I heard it was about our youth, the prison industrial complex and its effect on societies, but more importantly, holes. Humans have always been curious, fascinated by holes. And what's a better way to satiate that curiosity than digging up what's right underneath your own feet? You ever try to dig to China on a family vacation while you were on the beach? Everyone has. Nothing to be ashamed about. But did you ever think, well, how far could I go? How far has anyone gone? Well, you wouldn't be the only person curious enough to click on a video about holes. Not too long ago, they closed the deepest hole ever dug permanently. And its story is way more interesting than you might think. And trust me, this video will not leave you bored. Yeah, all right. The Kola Super Deep Borehole is the deepest hole in the world in the terms of true vertical depth from top to bottom. Now I have to put an asterisk here. You see, drilling wells don't necessarily go straight down. At a certain depth, they have to spiral to avoid some of the hardest rocks. This is Kola's drilling path. As you can see here near the bottom, they steer it instead of going straight down, kind of like tree roots. Now the Kola Borehole is not the longest anymore. That was surpassed by an oil well in Qatar back in 2008. But it's still the deepest, so it has a very special place in my heart. The Soviets are at the height of the Cold War, and they're looking for every scientific advancement they can get. You see, at the same time as the space race, there was another, less popular race happening between the superpowers. The journey to the center of the Earth. But just like in that movie, we have a $3 budget, and we're running this on an HP laptop we got in the clearance section of Micro Center. Both sides had the money and power to make it happen, but no one was really sure if it was possible. So in 1958, America started the project Borehole, which is a little drilling site off the coast of Mexico. But it only drilled about 600 feet down before those hole haters in Washington axed it. But the Soviets were already drilling a well of their own up in northern Scandinavia in the Kola Peninsula. Soviet scientists were getting ready to break. But why did they choose this location? A lot of other super deep wells started off the coast of the ocean, so they're already below sea level. The Soviets chose this isolated piece of the Arctic for good reason. You see, the Scandinavian Peninsula is part of something called the Baltic Shield. Basically the world's oldest rock pushed up near the surface. The Baltic Shield has some of the most ancient rocks in the world, perfect for Soviet researchers trying to get an upper hand on their understanding of Earth science. You see, one of the arguments at the time was that young sedimentary rocks had already really been studied during oil drilling, but no one ever really drilled down to the ancient parts of these rocks. So we needed to at least try. In the beginning, they used mostly regular but modified drilling equipment. But after a few years, they brought in a purpose-built Erlemash 15,000, named after the target depth of 15,000 meters. Now this thing was huge, and the size kind of became a problem. In big drilling equipment, there's this thing called a drill sting, which is a pipe that sends down drilling fluid and torque to the drill bit. If they really got to 15 kilometers, the drill sting alone would have to weigh 200 tons. After almost 10 years of work, they finally broke the world record depth previously held by an oil well in Oklahoma. In 1982, they got to around 11.5 kilometers and backtracked and branched a second hole off of the first at around 9 kilometers deep. Like I said earlier, drilling means finding the path of least resistance, avoiding the hardest rocks. So they backtracked and restarted a few times. A year later, they passed 12 kilometers in the second hole and stopped for more than a year to take some measurements and, more importantly, celebrate this new milestone. When word spread about this project, geologists expected some incredibly new, technologically advanced drilling equipment. But they were amazed to see that the Kola team had been using a type of drill head typically used for oil and regular drilling. What these geologists didn't know is that there was a stack of old, worn-out drill heads back at the super deep site. Turns out, although they were using regular drilling equipment, the drilling force and temperatures were so high that it was ripping these drill bits to shreds, so they had to be replaced every 7 meters or so. On top of that, they had to come up with new methods that have never been used before. Turns out when you have steel cables and pipes stretched down for over 12 kilometers, carrying hundreds of tons of weight, they can stretch by about 20 meters, making almost every measurement you took inaccurate unless you find a new way to adjust for that discrepancy. After more than a year of pause, they continued drilling on September 27th, 1984. 4 hours of drilling later, they successfully collected a few more meters, and it was time to bring up and check on the head. And the engineers tried to lift, and nothing happened. No problem, this sticking happens all the time. They increased the force and lifted again, and again, and it worked. The drill was finally coming to the surface, weighing a fraction of what it was supposed to. That's right, remember the drill string we talked about earlier? On the first day back, after more than a year off, it snapped, leaving 5 kilometers of piping and a drill bit at the bottom, stuck in the hole. 5 years of work down the literal drain. No one tell the supreme leader. They spent 7 months trying to save the 12-kilometer hole, until they backtracked and started a new branch at 7 kilometers. 6 years later, with a lot of reinforcements, they finally reached 12 kilometers again in the third hole. But every milestone came with more and more problems. They reached 12.2 kilometers in 1990 and continued trying until 1992 when they decided that they couldn't get any deeper no matter what they tried. The project was officially over. So what was all that work for? They'd only really dug about 0.2% of the way to the center of the Earth, but some seriously important scientific discoveries were made. In fact, part of the reason we know the history of the Earth and the solar system came from research at this hole. Turns out that the composition of rocks extracted about 3 kilometers deep were almost identical to the newly collected samples of lunar soil, which help us find out how the Earth and the Moon were formed in the first place. They also found much higher temperatures than expected down there. Which brings us to the weird legacy. My phone went off, god damn. Which brings us to the weird legacy following this hole. Where you have the Soviet secrecy, you also get conspiracies and theories. And conspiracies of those theories. If you search YouTube for videos about the Kola, you'll find recordings of reported screams from hell coming from the depths of the hole. Popular theories say the reason they stopped drilling wasn't the difficulty, but instead that they had dug straight down into hell. The workers were too scared to continue. More than 30 years after its closure, the Kola super deep borehole is largely forgotten. What's left was picked over by tourists. If you go there now, it looks like a map from a Fallout video game. But the ingenuity and the passion that people did to give some of the greatest scientific discoveries will not be forgotten. Although it will look like it is. The only thing standing being a red cap with the wrong depth on it.